Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Min and I'm your host, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast. The show that explains, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. Today we have a very special guest speaker, someone who's spoken on our podcast for the last 7 times now, the last year and a half, Dr Angad Singh from Nirvana Lifestyles, aka Center Constructions. How are you, Angad?
I'm very well, Min. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here as always.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. Today we're talking about the title, the podcast episode called The Impact of NDIS 2.0 on SDA's Future. Angad, what's your feedback? You spent the last 6 hours today studying the documentation, writing notes down. And what's your feedback in terms of your perspective and your opinion about what's been written?
I think for a smart SDA investor, there are both opportunities and threats, and they need to be considered, very carefully. I think it's very easy to take the highlight reel of this report and completely misunderstand the message in my view. And as I was reading it in detail, this morning in particular, I think we really need to do a longer session on this, which we'll follow up in a couple of weeks through a webinar and possibly a Q&A so people can get more detail. But there's a few really, really big bombshells, let's call it, that have come out of this recommendation. And I think maybe we spend this podcast talking about those 3 of the big bombshells, and then we can follow it up with a more detailed review through a webinar with your audience. How does that sound? So look, guys, to give you some context, for those of you that are in the SDA space as investors or SDA providers or potential investors, you've probably heard that there's been an NDIS review that has just dropped just before Christmas. When everyone was ready for a break, they go and drop this on us, right? And there has been a lot of opinions that have been floating around about this report. And there's been a lot of people who have taken certain things in this report and made it about SDA when it wasn't about SDA. So maybe as a starting point, we should just talk about what this report is actually about and what the scope of this report is and how they conducted the report so that you can understand at a high level where SDA fits in terms of this report, right? So the first thing to understand is that they conducted this major campaign to seek feedback from all of the different stakeholders in the NDIA space. Now, this is not just SDA. This is SDA, SIL, support coordinators, LACs, providers, you name it. Every single person who touches the SDA in any way, shape, or form has been invited to provide some commentary. And what has happened is that feedback has then been distilled into essentially 13 recommendations. And those 13 recommendations have something like 130 or 150 odd sub-recommendations. And of those, there are probably 2 recommendations that affect housing directly. So it's a very small part of this report. So that's the first thing I just wanted to clarify. And within those 2 recommendations, there are essentially 3 sub-recommendations, which I think are the bombshells of what is going on in the SDA industry. So maybe we should just speak about those and then we can unpack each of them in a bit of detail. What do you reckon, man?
Totally agree.
Now, guys, to be clear, what we're talking about is recommendation 8 and recommendation 9. These are the recommendations that directly affect the provision of SDA housing, all right? So the first recommendation, recommendation 8, and I'm reading here from the report, is this. Recommendation 8 is to fund housing and living supports that are fair and consistent and support participants to exercise genuine choice and control over their living arrangements, all right? Now, if you read the sub-recommendation in this, which is 8.1, what it effectively says is that the National Disability Insurance Agency should change the budget setting process to ensure that housing and living budgets are consistent and sustainable. Now, the way many people are reading this is that there should be budget cuts to SDA. Now, having looked at this, I don't think that's the case at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you parts of this report and I'm going to help understand what this recommendation is actually referring to. And then from there, we can try to dissect both the intent and the impact of these types of recommendations, right? So let's look at 8.1 in a bit of detail. And I'm reading again from the report. Here's what it says. Funding for participants requiring 24/7 living supports should typically be on the basis of those supports being shared. In general, reasonable and necessary funding should be based on an average shared support ratio of 1:3, consistent with the assessment of needs that determines the maximum support intensity and level of overnight support that a particular participant who is eligible will receive. Now, you might have heard this recommendation, and there are certainly some views out there that we should be building 3-person homes now, and people are going to get all these cuts and everything else. But we need to just unpack this in a bit more detail so that we know exactly what we're talking about, right? So let's just go through this line by line, and we'll talk about what this statement actually says, right? So the first thing is funding for participants requiring 24/7 living supports should typically be on the basis of those supports being shared. Okay. Now, there's a statement or there's a definition in here which we have to be clear about, right? And that is, what is 24/7 shared living support? This is not SDA. SDA is a very small subset of this category. Let's put it that way, right? So the report does go on to define that 24/7 means that an individual participant would require at least 8 hours of active support in a day and some form of other support for the other hours of the day, which might just be someone sleeping in a room next door. It could be a completely passive support for the rest of the day, and this person would be classified as the required for the 24/7 living support, right? Now, from the report, we know that around 41,000 participants are in this camp. Now, if you compare that to the SDA, which we know from other data, that the SDA participants at the end of June 2023 was around 22,000. So it's about double the participant pool than what we are dealing directly in with SDA, right? Now, when we look at this category of shared housing and living supports, the overall spending on this was around $8.8 billion, right? Which by the way, is up to financial year 23, $8.8 billion that year, which is a massive, massive part of the NDIS, right? However, remember, we are talking not about shared living supports when you and I have a conversation about SDA. We're talking about SDA. So let's just put that into context a little bit, right? So SDA, last financial year, the same financial year that we've got this $8.8 billion number, SDA accounted for $350 million expenses, right? Which, to put it into context, is less than 0.5% of the total housing and living budget or expenditure that is being discussed in this particular recommendation, right? And it's not this recommendation is not an attack on SDA or an attack on SDA funding, or even a suggestion that SDA funding should be split 1:3 and 1:2 is no longer appropriate, right? If you look at the total funding that has been spent in SDA, which is around that $350 million mark, SDA, it's only about half of the provision. Yeah, so SDA, even though the rest of the NDIS is completely blowing out, SDA is actually well under budget, right? And you compare that in context with, I think the last report that was published was at the end of 2022. There was around $1.4 billion worth of fraud in the NDIS at the end of 2022, right? So again, just put this into context. The entire budget for SDA is less than a quarter of the fraud that is occurring. Yeah, maybe less than a fifth. So SDA is absolutely not the intention here. What they are attacking is frankly the amount of fraud that is going on and the enormous expenditure that is happening aside from SDA in this particular, I guess, shared living category. Does that make sense, Ben? I mean, that's a bit of a monologue, Ben. Do you want to have anything to say at this point?
Let's keep on going, buddy. All good.
Keep on going. You want me just to keep reading, hey? And just tell you what I think.
Keep analysing. Give us your opinion. Everyone's entitled to their own interpretation of the recommendations. And
okay,
as I keep on reminding everyone else, this is merely recommendations, and until there's more clarity by the government to give us some direction, we're sort of in limbo trying to figure out what the truth is. Yeah.
So funding for participants requiring 24/7 living support should typically be on a shared basis. No one is surprised by that, especially when we're talking about everything related to shared living, which is SIL as well as SDA, right? In general, reasonable and necessary funding should be based on an average shared support ratio of 1:3. Now, this, by the way, guys, remember, we are talking about the full range of people that require 24/7 funding, which is about twice as many people that qualify for SDA. Yeah, at least at this current moment. It's double the SDA participant pool. So if you look at that pool of participants, of course, the average might be 1:3. However, when we are talking about SDA, we are talking about the upper half of that particular participant pool. Does that make sense? And there is still a needs assessment that needs to happen. So if, say, the person's needs is at high physical support, you would fully anticipate that they would have a funding ratio which would be different to someone at the lower end of that spectrum, even though the average might fall at 1:2. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally.
So it's really important to understand that SDA is a very small subcategory of this particular recommendation, and we should be cautious of how we interpret that particular recommendation, right? Now, the other thing to remember is what that 1:3 ratio does is it's useful for the NDIA so that they can set a provisional budget amount. It is not a recommendation of how people should live. And they're quite explicit about this. In fact, they even say this should create a provisional budget that is the maximum participants can use in considering different living arrangements. However, participants should have flexibility to choose living arrangements. The provisional budget should be individualized and not restricted, and not restrict choice of living arrangements to sharing supports with other participants with the same level of overnight support needs. So in other words, what they're trying to do is they're trying to set a provisional budget, but not mandate to people, particularly people with disabilities, of how they should live. And that's completely in line, I guess, with the manifesto of choice and control, right? So what they're effectively saying is that people should be allowed to live how they want to, even though the average budget should be about 1:3. So how do we kind of square these two together? And this is actually where I think a lot of the opportunities lie, and where we will see a lot of changes in the space moving forward, right? So how do you share supports even though people have a 1:2 housing or a 1:2 even an individual house, but their care budget or their support budget is 1:3? So how do people share supports across multiple households? And this is essentially, the report goes on to suggest some ideas, and it actually puts forward 3 potential ways that this might be the case. So firstly, the report is suggesting an innovation. So maybe we could consider new housing types. And if you think about the types of products that we're already doing and what SEAL providers are essentially asking for in order to make their operations viable, even though participants have a strong preference for 2-person households, what we can essentially do is have a cluster of houses within a small radius so that the SEAL provider can still get some economy of scale in a location. They might not be right next door because we want to spread them out. We don't want to create little ghettos or little communities, but at the same time, they're close enough that there can still be some sort of sharing across the dwelling. Does that make sense? So that's one idea that's proposed within the review. The other idea that's proposed within the review is that people could essentially share there could be a new category of supports which are most effectively delivered at that household level, right? So in other words, let's imagine you've got someone that needs to do your shopping or your gardening or something like that, right? What the SEAL provider could essentially do is bundle those up into a household level, right? And the household levels could come from a pool of funding, but the other care, like the direct care for an individual, may actually come from some other type of funding. This is what's being proposed. And in that way, the types of supports that actually benefit from being in the same household would essentially be separated out. And the SEAL provider would now have 2 options. One is that they could, let's just say that someone's funded at a 1:3 ratio, they've got an amount. What the SEAL provider could effectively do is increase the scope of their service to provide the same service to 1:2. So say, for example, maybe they do the shopping and the gardening, and instead of having 3 people in the house, now there's 2. So they do shopping, gardening, and maybe they also do the household cleaning as an idea, right? So they can increase their scope of work so they can still serve people that are in a smaller house, albeit the overall funding allowance is the same. Does that make sense? So that's what's being proposed here in the review. And finally, and this is quite interesting, is they're proposing that participants could actually allocate funds away from other supports and into their choice of housing. Now, this is completely new, by the way. This was not in the case in the current NDIS, and in fact, it's the opposite in the current NDIS.
Can you identify where that is in the documentation there?
What page?
What page or point clause or whatever?
Where is it stated in the review? And it's interesting because it's not actually stated in the section that they're talking about the sharing. It's actually in another section which references how they would create a type of environment where someone could have a living arrangement which has got nothing to do with the level of support that they are funded for. So this is what it says. This is page 141 of the report, by the way. Participants should have greater flexibility and more choice in their housing and living arrangements within the budget that has been allocated to them. But because of the centrality of living arrangements to a person's social and economic participation, health and well-being, housing and living budgets will be stated in a participant's overall budget. participants will be able to add funds from their flexible budget to increase the amount spent on housing and living supports, but not vice versa. Yeah. So what that's essentially saying, currently what is allowed in the NDIS is that when people have a core funding, they can allocate funds inside their core funding between other types of core funding. But SDA is actually what's called a capital support. It's not the same as a core support. And with capital supports, you can only use that funding for what that particular bucket is allocated for. And if you don't use it, you lose it, right? Also, you cannot take funding from other buckets and put it into that bucket if you want to, right? Now, what is being proposed in this review is that what if we made the housing bucket the bucket that you could allocate any funds, any of your funds for anything that you have that you may not want or need? You can allocate them into housing, but you can't allocate your housing funds away from housing. Does that make sense?
Yes, but can you give our listeners an example how that would work? I mean, what circumstances would a participant bring funding from another funding amount into the housing and living funding? To try to think of examples here. What examples can you think of? Because in theory, they would already have the SDA approved funding for that category, for that house design. So why would they bring that over?
Yeah. So maybe this is the point, right? So let's just say somebody is funded at a level for SDA, but they really want to have a higher level of SDA, right?
You mean like someone who needs robust villa but didn't get approved for it, and they actually get given IL funding, for example.
Kind of like that, but probably a better example would be someone has been funded for housing as to 1 into 3, but does not want to live 1 into 3. They would rather live 1 into 2. Now they can, at their own level, say, listen, I'm funded for 1 into 3, but I don't really need some of this other budget that's been allocated to me, or I'm happy to cut here and put that into my housing budget so I can live in a more independent way.
Okay,
right?
So an example could be, Angad, an IL, three IL participants are living in a house, an IL house somewhere in the suburbs. Uh-huh. One of them says, I don't want to be living with 2 other people who are in this area. I want to live by myself independently. I want to go live in an apartment in the inner city. However, the investor, landlord, or the SDA provider says, my funding being 65,000 is too low. I want to transfer 20, 30 grand of my other supports into my home and living funding, top up to 90 grand to offer that to the SDA provider and landlord, so that I'm actually that 90 grand funding for SDA income for the investor. That's what 100%. That means, right? Yes.
That's what it means. Yeah. Now, please understand, this is commonplace in core funding supports. So all your core funding supports, it's a flexible budget. You can use it for what you want to. If you want to go on a retreat this year, you can use that. If you don't want to go, you don't have to use that budget. You can use it for something else, like a different type of core support service. Does that, this is already the case for your core supports. What they're proposing is that now your core supports, if any leftover budget, you can allocate it directly to housing. You could not do that, right? Now, what this means from an impact perspective, I think, is that now participants are more empowered to choose what they actually want.
Exactly.
Which means you should be building more and more what people want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what Minister Bill Shorten said in his speech? He said, if people don't want to live in a group home, that's okay. They don't have to live in a group home. They can choose. They have choice control in how and who they live with. And this is what you're saying now is a precursor to that very 100%. Approach.
Yes. What they were finding was that the way that funding was allocated previously, like this is your housing budget, use it or lose it, right? Too bad. If you got leftover funding in your core supports and you haven't used it, too bad. You can't do anything with that, right? Now what they're saying is, hey, listen, you can allocate that to housing if you want, right? So this gives people much more flexibility as to what type of SDA they can choose. It's not just whatever's been mandated to them. They can upgrade for themselves if they want to by allocating their own core funds into the particular housing. Now, if you look at how much do people in general value housing, right? If you look at the income that people are spending on houses, on accommodation, it's, something like 30, 40%, maybe up to 60, 70% in some instances people spend on their house, right? SDA is less than 0.5% of the shared living budget, less than 0.5%. So you fully understand that people are being forced to live in houses they don't want to live in. They're being forced into shared circumstances that they don't want to be in. And the reason is because they can't get more funding for that particular item. By giving them more flexibility, it gives them more choice as to what types of things that they can choose. And that's completely aligned with the vision of the NDIA. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that that's what they're trying to do. And what the impact for developers and investors means that, hang on a second, if someone was just in your house because that was the only funding they could achieve, and it was a 1 into 3, say, Now they are empowered to leave. They don't have to get a review from the NDIA. They can allocate their own funds away from that if they choose to. Make sense?
It is creating a much more flexible environment for participants, for sure,
Correct.
yes.
And that is fully the intention. That is exactly what we're trying to do. A more flexible environment creates more choice and control for participants, which is entirely the intent of the NDIA in the first instance. So, look, that was a lot to unpack there, and that's just one small section of one of the recommendations. But I wanted to touch on this because when people are talking about this, I'm seeing other SDA, spokespeople, I could say, who are suggesting that the way to interpret this is to start building 3 participant houses, and I think that couldn't be further from what one should do based on this recommendation. This recommendation refers to all shared living supports.
Wait. Who was saying you have to build 1 to 3? Who said that?
That is some people, and I don't want to name names on this podcast, right? There are some people who, after reading this recommendation, have taken this recommendation to mean that the strategy moving forward for SDA design should be 3 participant houses.
Mate, they're
Right?
bloody fools. They're bloody fools. That's all I can say. Shame on you for reading it wrong, you, whoever you are. But you know what? Here's my feedback to you, right? This, first of all, this is a bloody recommendation, okay? It's not implementation. That's number one. Number two, It is talking, what is the NDIS? The NDIS is pretty much a SIL environment here. Not an SDA.
Yes.
It's not the SDA environment. It's SIL business. So therefore, the concept of 1 to 3, look, whoever you are, silly Billy.
Yeah.
Use a bit of common sense, please. This is a SIL environment.
Yeah.
This is all about SIL funding, SIL supports, SIL housing. It's not about SDA support. They got it all wrong. Look, the truth be told, this is my opinion. SDA will remain 1 to 2. SIL housing will be 1 to 3, and a plus. That's just the way it's going to be.
Yeah, potentially, or not. Like, I mean, I don't think we can go that far just yet. That needs to be unpacked a little bit further. But what we can say for sure is that this specific recommendation that you may hear people saying that moving forward funding is 1 to 3 is not referring to SDA. It is not. It is referring to the overall shared housing and living supports, which is about double the pool of participants. And the needs of SDA is a subset of that, and it's the highest needs of that subset, right? So important to acknowledge that when we put our SDA lenses on, we start to see everything as an SDA thing. And when it says fund housing and living supports, we assume that all they're talking about is SDA. It's not the case. We've got to have a broader picture and understand that this report is written about the NDIS, not SDA in particular. Okay?
Angad, in my opinion, is let those fools go on their merry path. Forget about them. Then let them make the mistakes, and they'll come back and say, "I told you so." Okay?
Yeah. Look, and look, it's interesting because we look at these recommendations, and honestly speaking, I'm quite supportive of pretty much all of them. I think that the people that are going to be most hurt by these recommendations are the people that have been trying to exploit the system. It is, the NDIA has a very clear vision. It's provide choice and control to participants through services that are reasonable and necessary, and do it in a way that's value for money. That's it. If you do that as a provider, you're going to be in good company. The NDIA changes, reforms, everything that happens moving forward is going to suit you, right? If you're trying to find little holes and little weasel gaps to exploit in the short term, you will get stuck. This is converging. These recommendations are converging on the intent of the NDIA. They're not completely random. It's not like they're just drawing these out of a hat. They're looking at the system saying, hey, here's what we wanted. Here's where we've landed. What do we need to do to get closer to what we wanted? And I think that where they're going is directionally a good thing. Obviously, there's some hiccups along the way, but I think it's a good thing.
The biggest issue here is this was a NDIS review, NDIS 2.0. It wasn't an SDA review, SDA 2.0.
That's right.
The biggest thing I see out there, this is my 3.5 years experience in the NDIS world, full time.
Yeah.
I'm not a part-timer. I'm not a part-timer like all you boys out there listening here, right? I'm a full-timer.
Yeah.
And shame on you. The thing is, so many people in the SDA don't understand the SIL world. And so many people in the SIL world don't understand the SDA world. It's the same coin, but it's different sides of the coin. And unless you spend years in disability care supports to understand how it all works, why it works the way it does, then you're not going to be able to understand both sides of the equation. So, that's why we in the SDA world need to be more appreciative and supportive and understanding of the challenges that the SIL environments, supports, funding and provision of care have and their limitations. But the big picture here is NDIS 2.0 is all about making it a more transparent, more flexible, and more happier environment for participants, because the words choice and control is used too loosely and it has minimal meaning to participants because they don't really have choice and control. They don't, and I've spoken to so many different providers and participants and they all say the same thing, it isn't there. It's just too loosely used and there's no meaning to it anymore. So as Bill Shorten said in his review, we want to bring choice and control back to participants, wherever they are, and give them more power to choose to live the life they want. And as you say, it's getting rid of fraud, minimising it, having a bigger task force in the NDIS Commission to bring down the fraudsters, make it more efficient, make it more sustainable, having a shared funding model from a federal and state level between territories and states and federal government to ensure that there is sustainability. So keywords here are sustainability,
100%.
Choice of control.
Yep, reasonable and necessary.
Yeah,
value for money. These are all they've been saying the same thing ever since the beginning.
Yeah, but now they're enforcing it. They're enforcing it.
They're getting closer. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That actually takes us to our next point, though. That recommendation 9.10. This is the recommendation where they're suggesting, and I'll read this for you. The National Disability Insurance Agency should introduce a new SDA category for participants funded for shared living support, but not eligible for any of the existing SDA categories. Right? What do you think of that?
Well, I, like many other people, read it a certain way. And I have a funny feeling you're about to educate me on why myself and many others have read that wrong. So please enlighten us peasants on what it all means, please.
Oh, man. Come on, you've been too hard on yourself. Look, let's I think, but for the people that aren't at the coalface, for the people that aren't seeing and living this every single day, like we are, they may not understand where this is coming, right? So it's probably worth telling people, because you started touching on this. It's referred to in the report as client capture, and it's for all those people, like we said, that there's about as many people that are eligible for SDA. There's double that many that have shared living supports that need to live somewhere and share supports, but they're not funded for SDA, right? So all of SDA there's a whole nother pool of people that's the same side, right? So what's happening at the moment is right now the government or the NDIA only allocates funding for the SIL. So what happens is the SIL providers, what they do is they set up these little houses and they put 3 or 4 people in these houses and they share the supports across these individuals, and they also control the houses, right? So this is what's happening to all the other people that are not eligible for SDA, right? The issue is the same that we are worried about in SDA. So in other words, when someone controls both your care and your house, they basically have, they've got you by the neck. And this review recognizes that there's an enormous proportion of those people that are actually what they describe as captured in SIL housing, right? Which they cannot get funding for SDA. They don't meet the current level of SDA. Remember, SDA is only at the moment, maybe like 3.8% of NDIS participants are SDA. There's a whole other pool which doesn't get that funding. Does that make sense? All of these people are currently living in SIL houses, and there's a view that's shared in this review that is not in line with choice and control for the participant, which I think is what you're getting at as well, right?
Well, let me say something here, because I love this private conversation. It's a one-on-one conversation that everyone is eavesdropping on, right?
Yeah.
I've said for a long time, for more than 3 years now, that the way it is set up, it's flawed by way of the fact that, I'm being pessimistic here, right? Call me a person, in this theoretical example of me being a provider who's manipulated the rules to my advantage, right?
Okay.
As a SIL provider, I have my SIL participants in my group homes all around a certain location, and I'm running a business I want to be commercial. I want to make my margins and profitability, right? Now, why would I, as a provider, vet and source SDA potential participants from my business and send them on their merry way to another provider,
somewhere else,
to another SDA provider somewhere else, and then I lose the funding, right, in this house, because I've lost 2, 3, 4 participants from the same house. Why would I, as a business person, SIL provider, do that? That's just silly of me, wouldn't it? That's just commercial. That's just being a capitalist, running a business, making money, and controlling their database and their business, right? But again, as you'll say to me in a minute, where's the choice and control in that? And
Yeah.
And as a provider, I'll be like, well, I don't care. It's my business and I'll do what I want.
It's my business I'm trying to make. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm a commercially motivated private enterprise.
I'm a landlord, and I'm providing support to people who don't need any better. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is where the two hats thing. People wearing silver hats in the SDA hat, the conflict of interest, and the lack of choice and control. Exactly.
Yeah. Now, this, by the way, I think represents an enormous opportunity for the good actors to recognize what the impact of this is on what we do in the SDA space, right? So overnight, your SDA pool doubles, right? That's important to recognize that now what is currently happening is the SIL providers are making very, very good margins because there is effectively inside that SIL funding enough funding for them to run a house as well. Yeah. Now we have tried, you and me, I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time. How do we create SIL houses? Because honestly, that's what the market needs in many ways. There's many, we know that for all the people in SDA, there's all the people that don't get SDA, and there's many of them, that need some sort of accommodation. And we know that that there isn't really great solutions. Like we hear about SIL providers getting these run down, shoddy properties and putting people in them. Not only are people getting inappropriate accommodation, they're also, they're basically being completely controlled by one particular enterprise. They have no freedom and flexibility in that arrangement. So we know that SIL housing is important for us to provide, but we haven't been able to because there's no funding allocated. We have not really been able to make it stack commercially for investors. And I'm not talking like in a greedy way. I'm talking about just in a reasonable way that investors should expect the return for the type of risk that they're taking, right?
So let me use an example of an old conversation you and I have had probably 8-9 months ago in another podcast episode to bring this explanation to light. So a robust house or a duplex is, block of land in the middle somewhere away from another estate. But a duplex is a fire-rated wall down the middle for one place on each side. The cost to build, the cost to develop is going to be larger price for a block of land, larger cost for construction. Probably end up being $1.3, $1.2, $1.3, $1.4 million for this duplex house.
Yeah.
However, the funding for occupant number 1 plus OOA, occupant number 2 plus OOA is going to be $70,000 each, right?
Yeah.
And then from a commercial point of view, the rate of return, the yield, is going to be $140,000 total minus cost is $110, $100 net. $100 net income on a $1.3 million acquisition is only 7% or so net.
Not enough.
And that's not enough. So in that regard there, because of the commercialization, or if that's a word there, doesn't fit the reasons why the investor should proceed with an SDA duplex build for two separate robust participants living separately on their own with the carer. There's no product being created. So if there's no product being created, then there's no place for these participants who are in limbo to go.
Yes.
So therefore, and I'll give an example here. In this scenario of these two occupants, they might have their $70,000 robust funding in a townhouse duplex villa calculation number.
Okay.
$70,000 is the magic number there, but their support is probably $500,000. Okay.
Yes.
$500,000.
Yeah.
So now in this proposal you're talking about here, if you read here, they would have the right to transfer 30, 40, 50K over from one bucket to the other bucket to be filled
the
up.
housing bucket. Yes.
To then go, well, here's their funding as organised by the SDA provider to present to an investor to then make it commercial enough to actually proceed with the construction development of the product.
Correct. Now, what you're talking about, though, is already someone who's already eligible for SDA, who is now allocating some funds away from some other core support into their SDA, right? However, this particular topic is all of those people that have no SDA and that would not be eligible for SDA. Remember, SDA? So remember, to be eligible for SDA, there is a very high bar. You have to demonstrate to the NDIA that you have either or both an extreme functional impairment and very high support needs, right? So those two things, you have to be able to demonstrate those. It's a very, very high bar. Remember, only 3.8% of all the participants on the NDIS have eligibility for SDA, right? We're talking about the pool that sits just below that 3.8% that currently has zero fund. What is happening is they don't quite meet the need for, because they're not extreme functional impairment, they may be high functional impairment, but not extreme. They have to go into what's called SIL housing, which is housing provided by a care provider. They basically rent a house. They have 3 rooms in a house. They put them in one of the rooms and they care for them. And they collect the SIL funding. Right.
And the max they can allowed to pay is $165 a week from their pension. That's it.
Correct. But all the other funding is actually captured in the SIL budget. So what they're doing, and the SIL providers are making a killing doing it, right? They're making really, really good margins by doing this type of SIL housing. What they're doing now.
And let me clarify what you said there. They're making a killing, they're making a bucket, right? I'll tell you right now, 2 SDA participants in an SDA house, that's worth $1 million a year of revenue to the SIL business right there.
Yeah, but you see, if they're funded, if someone is funded, if they're not eligible for SDA, they may still have the same SIL funding as someone in SDA. Do you get what I mean? Like they still might need the same level of support or similar level of support, but they don't require SDA because again, they don't quite meet the criteria for SDA in that they don't require the person-to-person supports. They require something else, right? Again, SDA is hard to get, man. It's a small percentage of people that get it. All those other people are living in SIL houses or are asking to live in SIL houses. And an investor cannot build a great SIL house at the moment because they get nothing for it. Nothing, right? Instead, what's happening is the SIL provider is getting all of that uplift and taking it, as provision of the care. Now, for
themselves, yes, for themselves.
Yeah, look, for themselves. I mean, I'm not trying to say SIL providers being unethical because they're doing what they're doing, and what they're doing, honestly, the world is better that they're doing it than if they did nothing. So I'm not having a go at SIL providers. Please don't read it like that. What I'm saying is that in that SIL funding, and maybe I'll read it from the report, this is what it says, right? A new shared living category should be designed with participants and the sector to enable delivery of best practice and cost-effective supports for participants funded for shared housing and living supports. That's what we mean by SIL houses, right? Funding of the new category should only cover the additional capital costs with providing shared supports safely and effectively. This should be offset by a decrease in an implicit capital subsidies in supported independent living packages. What they're trying to say is that inside the SIL funding, we already give them money to manage the house. Let's take away the money to manage the house and give that to an SDA provider. That's all. So we're just taking some of the SIL budget that is already allocated for the housing and separating that out and saying, no, SIL provider, you don't provide the housing. Please give it to an SDA provider. So there's still that separation. Now the SDA provider makes an income. And now all of a sudden, this whole category is now opened up. Now it won't be 20% returns. Probably not. Gut feel, this will look similar to where the old IL budget was. So you should be expecting returns maybe 12, 14%, something like that, which is still good.
No. That's 12 to 14 is where it is right now, net. I reckon this will be probably 7 to 10. This is lower.
No, look, I think it'll be similar. It'll be similar to the old. Look, I mean, we're all speculating, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard to say without some more data. But when you look at how they calculate the costs of the capital costs that they're referring to, right? There's essentially very little difference in the maintenance of a SIL house as an IL SDA. There's very little difference, right? So if you look at how they've basically costed everything up till now, and you make an assumption they're going to cost it similarly, I think it'll land at around 60% of the current IL budget, right? That's my gut feel. And I've only done some back of the napkin calculations, so it really could be anything. But it's 7 to 10, and maybe 7 to 10% is an appropriate number if you're in Sydney or Melbourne. Those yields are not commercially attractive enough in Perth because, our base yields are like 5% or something. So they still need to make it compelling in Perth. And I think it'll look very similar to what the old IL looked like, where you were achieving returns around 14%. Right.
The old IL numbers was 65 grand a year for 2 IL participants in a house, and 75 to 3. Yeah, so 65.
And the house, 65, and the house would have cost you around 550 or something, right? Because it was a smaller block of land, it was a smaller house, and no spec, and all the rest of that stuff. This is back then, though. Remember when we were doing an age? Obviously, build costs. That was pre-COVID, so build costs changed a lot.
Land costs and build prices are higher, so therefore that 65-ish on a 800 is still going to be 8% right now, gross and 6% net.
It might. When I say it'll be similar, I mean it'll be similar in terms of relativity. So it could well be that someone with IL on a 2-participant home at this moment is getting funded for around 80 grand, something like that, 85 grand, right? And if this person is somewhat lower than that, it might be more like 50 grand is where I think it'll land, right? So a house that you are now building for cheaper than an IL, and maybe the next thing we'll talk about is the elimination of IL, by the way, because that's the other recommendation. But we're talking about a house that looks very similar to a normal house, but somewhere between, something maybe slightly more.
Yeah.
And I think at first glance, I think that these might be larger houses with more participants, so potentially 3 participants, as you said. Now,
Hey,
it's really
okay,
important to understand this, though.
Stop right there.
Okay.
The LHA build standard around Australia. That's almost, but not there to IL standard. So could the LHA standard be that potential benchmark there that we're talking about here? Because it's not IL, but almost, yeah.
Yeah, potentially. But you know what's interesting, right? When you talk to SIL providers about this, about what would a great SIL house look like, and what they'll always tell you is, look, we can have it as pretty much IL, but please give us one bathroom that's fully accessible or to that standard, HPS standard. One bathroom HPS in the house, which can be shared. And then if you're going to put individual participant bathrooms, they can be more like an IL bathroom, right? So they still need more accessibility than what we provided by LHA, at least as a best practice, right? Now, what's important though, and we've got to keep this front of mind, is what the SIL providers want, which is a 1-to-3 ratio to make an efficient delivery of care, is not necessarily what participants want, which is privacy and independence. We as developers, designers, builders have to figure out a way to make everyone happy through our design work, right? How do we create houses and dwellings that provide the privacy and independence in the form of the amenity that is being sought after by participants, at the same time provide the economy of scale that's being sought after by the SIL providers? This is the challenge. This is our job, right? So I'm not saying that we should all start building 3-participant SIL houses. I'm saying that now that the funding is likely to be unlocked for this sector, this requires and demands, I would say, serious investigation and stakeholder engagement about how we might provide a best-in-class product that would serve the participants of this sector and the SIL providers who are currently providing the care in this sector. Now, remember, this is not the SDA sector, not the current SDA sector. This is the same size as the current SDA sector, but at just that one tier below where SDA is currently funded for, right? So it's a huge market, huge, at least as big as the current SDA market, and probably growing faster. And if we can design a product in this space, I feel like this is going to be something something I'm certainly looking forward to, and is very exciting for us, moving into 2024.
Another thing that was raised in the review was the federal government working with the states and territories to fund the refurbishment and renovations of existing legacy group homes that are out there. What are your thoughts on that great idea, theoretically, but practically almost impossible to deliver when there's living in those products which are really outdated and probably and are definitely not fit for purpose, to relocate them somewhere else to get it refurbished?
Yeah, I think so to be clear, I think the recommendation is talking about the collaboration between the governments more than it is about it's saying that at the moment what's happening at a government level is that the NDIA falls into the playground of the federal government. The federal government is allocating this funding. And you know how funding works at government levels. If I don't have the funding for it, I don't want to do it. And frankly, I would rather spend money on something else so that I can get elected for something else, right? So what the suggestion is that the state, federal and local governments need to acknowledge that taking care of people is not just a federal responsibility. Every level of government has to be aligned in this vision. Yeah. And currently, which is interesting, is that the community housing is actually run at the state level, right? At least in WA. I don't know if this is true for every other state, but community housing is run at the state level, which is not funded by, and they don't get SDA funding or any of the NDIS pool, and NDIS is at a federal level. So this is the disconnect that's happening. So now what they're trying to do is saying, listen, the people that currently have disabilities are living in community housing and it's not fit for purpose. We have to fund to make it fit for purpose, right? And I think, so directionally, I think it's the right idea. However, do we trust the government to essentially carry out renovation works that are value for money? I don't know. They haven't really the whole reason for SDA is that the government tends to squander cash on these types of things. The private sector is usually pretty good, provided they're incentivized properly and they can't commit fraud and everything else. They're usually pretty good at carrying out these types of things. So I think that overall the recommendation is a good one, that the two governments still work closer together. We do need to provide better accommodation for the people that are currently in government-funded, state government-funded accommodation. However, refurbishing that accommodation, maybe not, or giving them the allocation so that they can actually live in different types of SDA, I think is a better way to do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. No, let's watch the space.
Yeah, definitely watch this space, right?
Are we going to cover the third topic, or are we going to stop right there? What are your thoughts?
Look, I think we should go into the third topic because you can't. This is the bombshell that everyone's been talking about, right? It's about the improved livability, the suggestion that IL should be eliminated altogether as an SDA category. I think we need to unpack that for people. Now, guys, remember, we're only going through a very high-level summary here. Join the webinar. It'll be in a couple of weeks when Min and I book that in. But we'll go through a lot more detail, and I'm sure you have many more questions, and we'd love for you to provide your opinion if you've read it a different way. We'd love to have a dialogue with you about this, right? So let's round it out and talk about the impact on IL dwellings in particular, right? Now let's read the recommendation word for word, and then we can see what they're saying, and we can start to talk about the intent and everything else. So the National Disability Insurance Agency should remove the improved livability category for new specialist disability accommodation and review the remaining SDA categories and associated design standard to evaluate their effectiveness. Okay? So what that's saying, guys, currently IL and FA are funded about the same. Why do we have two things when we only need one? And secondly, I think you should do a review of the whole thing, because if two of them are exactly the same, how do we know that the other three are actually correct, right? So this is what they're saying, and I kind of agree with them. Now, I mean, you and I, we've been talking about this for some time, right? Now, we were probably one of the first people that adopted IL back in the day when no one was building IL. And then after the last review, you'll notice that we've actually stopped building IL only in the main, right? Most of what we build now is compatible across all the categories, right? And we kind of arrived at the same conclusion that they're now saying in December. We kind of came to that same conclusion in June. Do you remember? So I think it's important to understand that if you're looking at the guidelines, you understand the NDIA, what their intention is, choice and control, reasonable and necessary, value for money. If we can see abundantly a disconnect with what's on the ground, which is that IL funding is so high that FA funding is almost the same, right? And obviously FA price costs a lot more to build than IL. That doesn't feel right. Now, let's be a bit more particular about this. Does this mean that everyone who is currently in IL will now be left on the street? Absolutely not. It does not mean that, right? Everyone who's currently in IL will be grandfathered. That's true. However, I think what you guys have to remember is that the people who are currently in IL could also live in an FA. I think the impact of this will be that IL and FA will effectively consolidate into one category, and another category, which is below the current IL but covers the other circa 20,000 people that need accommodation, will emerge, right? So I don't think this will reduce the pool of participants. In fact, it'll probably increase the pool of FA participants on overall. And I don't think we should be thinking that this is a major change, when I think it's really just a minor tweak to how the categories are to be, constructed. What do you think, Ben?
No, I totally agree. As you were talking, my mind went onto another little cloud somewhere up there. Yeah, and it was going back to the fact that we know it has been very hard to get SDA funding. We know that, right? Yes, that's a fact. Participants all around Australia have been complaining, we can't get SDA funding. It's too hard. It's not worth it. I don't want to go down. I don't get into that path. Well, they are the cohorts right there, sitting there just outside of IL.
Yes,
who didn't get SDA and would really love it, but they can't because the NDIS Commission was so strict on the approvals. We know that.
Yes.
So I think this is where the government, the NDIS 2.0 is like, well, we are aware of the mistakes of the past previous government, their leadership, their stewardship, how the AAT was there to block and deny a lot of approvals for SDA. We know that. It's just that's public news now. The last 3 years. Now that cohort you're referring to, the 20,000 there or 40,000, whatever that number is, right? 40,000 there. They deserve to be part of SDA, but so this is what the creation of a new category they're talking about.
Correct.
Gives some comfort to them to say, hey, we know we know you're there. We're going to look after you. Here's a new category, and that's where we're going with this. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly right. It means that the new category of SDA will cover a cohort that is not currently covered by SDA funding, and accordingly, the pool of SDA participants would likely double pretty much overnight if they implement this. And that new category will be something different and at a lower standard and lower specification. So I shouldn't say lower. I should say
bespoke.
Bespoke. It might not be, the quality still might be really great when I say lower specification compared to the design category, right? Still good quality products and everything else. I'm saying that it'll cover that. It'll be somewhere below the IL, what IL currently requires, right? However, I do think that many people that are currently getting IL funding will just get bumped over to FA. and anyone new who would be eligible for SDA at all, like who is currently eligible for SDA, would just go straight into FA. FA will be the new entry level for SDA.
Did the paper say that there will be a fifth category, or they're saying it's a new category on its own right? What's the wording there?
Yeah, so they're saying a new category in its own right. Yeah. So this is read in conjunction with the other recommendation that they should remove IL. So removing IL is one recommendation, adding another category is another recommendation. Two separate recommendations. Read together, we will likely end up with 4 categories and across twice as many different, across a broader spectrum of need. That's what I suspect. Yeah.
To be honest, the whole IL topic, I mean, even though a year ago you and I saw the numbers, saw the gaps, and it was the way to go, we were right to start that path. But
yes,
the importance of IL is more of a stopgap to fill in the vacancies and all this empty FA HPS homes and robust homes.
Yes.
That's why the IL category is important for the last year. That's the reason why.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to this a little bit, just so people have context, right? So we obviously came to the same conclusion as this review is proposing, although the reasons were very, very different. So it might help people to understand, how did we decide to stop building IL-only products in the main after the review came out? And there was a few reasons. So the first reason was in that review, which, I'm talking about the NDIS pricing review, which was released in June, right? Now, in that review, and I think as late as maybe around September, they republished this. Do you remember the NDIA was telling a story, certainly before the SDA, before we started getting some real data, that they expected around 75% of participants would be IL? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Do you remember that bit? Yeah. Now, however, this is what they were saying back in 2019 or 2020 or whatever it was. And certainly was what was the feedback on the ground, was what people were hearing. However, in the review that was published in June last year and again supported in September last year, where they published the demand forecasts, the number of IL participants that they were forecasting at maturity was 35% or something. It was 1/3 of the market, nowhere near the 3/4 that was initially suggested, right? So that was the first reason. Firstly, we recognized that, hang on, IL only covers 1/3 of the market, not 3/4 like we were initially thinking. That was the first part of it, right? The data changed on that. The second thing was, we started getting feedback from people with disabilities, from the SDA providers who were engaging people with disabilities to live in houses, that there was a significant amount of anxiety experienced by a participant who knew that whilst they were IL today, they may in the future become FA or HPS, right? So say, for example, someone has Huntington's or MS or any one of these conditions that is degenerative in nature. They can't predict when their condition is going to get worse. They know it's going to get worse one day, but they don't know when. Now they have to pick a house today, knowing next month or the month after, or maybe the next year, who knows, that they can't live here anymore. So that turns out, anecdotally, I don't have a statistic around this, but from what I'm hearing from providers who are at the coalface, they're saying that something like 60% of disabilities get worse. Okay? So we have this, number one, we know that IL is no longer 3/4, it's only 1/3. Number two, 60% of the people that are currently IL will likely get worse anyway. So that's important to understand. And why not provide for them as well, so that the house can adapt and change with them, so we provide a better product to the participants that live there. And lastly, we actually saw the last thing that came out of the review was the massive increase in IL funding. Now, the reason, while everyone else jumped at IL, the reason we stopped doing IL was our prediction, or our view at that moment, was that the difference between IL funding and HPS funding was no longer significant enough, right? In other words, we knew that there was a lot of HPS product coming online. And before that, someone who had a HPS house was unlikely to accept an IL participant because of the funding gap. Now, someone with a HPS house will be very happy to accept an IL because the funding gap is not so large. So in other words, before these IL people had no options. Now, because the funding is so much higher, they've actually got access to any other category. And investors are very happy to give them essentially take a small hit on the maximum return, but still get a very good return with IL. And so they now have access to other HPS and FA houses, right? Now, how do we as developers and investors ensure, because our whole mission is to be the best products, right? How do we make sure that our houses are the best? We have to acknowledge that even when we're dealing with IL participants, we're competing with other HPS houses. Does that make sense? So we put all this together and we're thinking, you know what? We really should be creating products that are adaptable. We understand that people have budgets, so we can't just deck everything out for HBS. We get that. But we can design something in such a way that we can build it to IL today, and at any moment, without any headache, or without much headache, I should say, we could very easily upgrade that to HBS. Right, and that was essentially the new products that we launched shortly after the review. That was the intent of those products, is to be able to create that flexibility whilst creating the adaptability for the participants who are ultimately going to live in these houses. You know what I mean?
It's a great concept to have, and I think that having that mini maxi design you've created allows flexibility for an uncertain future as well in SDA.
Yeah. And, I think we'll be benefited largely by the recommendations if they happen, and it will open up a whole new type of SDA housing, which I'm very, very excited for, and I think is absolutely necessary. And I think we'll create a new type of product, which, I'm really looking forward to sinking my teeth into it and figuring out what this should look like.
Exactly. So, listener, I think we should save the rest for last, and last being the webinar in a few weeks' time. We should bring on board another 2-3 speakers onto this panel and have a nice open discussion. What do you think?
Cool. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. You can.
Yeah.
You're the one who's got all the cool friends in the NDIA space, so I'll let you pick the speakers.
I'll find your arch enemies and put them on with you.
Okay, the enemies. All right, cool. It's always good to have discussions with people that disagree with you, though. Yeah. Let's. What we'll do is we'll do the webinar. Let's allow a full 90 minutes or even a couple hours for that webinar. Let's go through every recommendation, unpack it, talk about it, answer questions, and hopefully we can have a very clear future, even in spite of the uncertainty that's put in front of us.
No worries. Thank you so much for your time, Angad. Bye-bye.
My pleasure, mate. We'll talk soon. Ciao. Bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.